The county clerk looked up from her computer screen with an expression I didn't understand yet, the specific, careful confusion of someone about to tell you something she genuinely doesn't know how to phrase gently, and said, "Ma'am, I'm not finding any marriage license on file under either of these names for that date." I laughed, actually laughed out loud, standing at that counter, certain she'd simply made a filing error, because I had a physical copy of that license sitting in a fireproof box at home, one I'd looked at dozens of times over the preceding 11 years, one that had our names, our signatures, an officiant seal, every single detail a legal document should have. My name is Renata Castellano, I'm 42 years old, and this is the story of the 11 years I spent legally, financially, and emotionally invested in a marriage that, according to every official government record in the state of Georgia, had never actually happened at all, and the specific, devastating discovery that my husband, Aldous, had known exactly that from the very first day we exchanged vows. I need to take you back to the beginning of our relationship first, because you won't understand the true scope of what I eventually discovered without understanding exactly how genuinely, completely I trusted this man for over a decade of my life. Aldous and I met at a mutual friend's dinner party when I was 30 and he was 34, both of us at a point in our respective careers where we'd started to feel a specific kind of pressure to settle into something more permanent than the string of shorter relationships either of us had managed up to that point. He worked, at the time, in what he described as a modest family manufacturing business he'd recently inherited a stake in, and I worked as a commercial real estate agent, a career I genuinely loved, one I'd built carefully over nearly a decade of long hours and difficult clients before finally reaching a level of success I felt proud of. I remember the specific, easy comfort of our early courtship, the way Aldous listened, genuinely and attentively, to stories about my work that most men I'd dated previously had found tedious. He asked thoughtful questions about zoning regulations, about difficult negotiations, about the specific satisfaction of closing a deal that had seemed impossible weeks earlier. I fell for him, I think now looking back, partly because he made me feel like my own ambition was something to be admired rather than managed or minimized, a quality I hadn't fully realized I'd been missing until I finally experienced it. We dated for just over a year before he proposed, a proposal that felt, at the time, genuinely spontaneous and heartfelt, delivered on a weekend trip to the mountains rather than anything elaborately staged. I said yes without a single moment of hesitation. I want to describe our engagement period in some detail, because several small, specific decisions Aldous made during those months, decisions I filed away at the time as simply practical or thoughtful, took on an entirely different meaning once I finally understood, years later, exactly what he'd actually been arranging behind the scenes. He suggested, roughly 2 months before our wedding, that we handle the marriage license application ourselves rather than working through the wedding planner we'd hired for the broader ceremony logistics, explaining that he wanted to personally handle the boring paperwork stuff so I could focus entirely on the parts of the wedding that actually mattered to me. I remember finding this considerate at the time, a small, practical kindness from a man eager to reduce my stress during an already overwhelming planning period. I had no idea, sitting in our kitchen nodding along to that suggestion, that I was actually agreeing to remove myself entirely from the one piece of this entire process where I might have caught with my own eyes, exactly what he was actually doing instead of filing legitimate paperwork. Our wedding day itself, I want to be clear, felt, in every way I experienced it at the time, like a genuine, joyful ceremony. We married in a small chapel outside Atlanta, roughly 80 guests present, my own parents visibly emotional throughout the entire proceeding, Aldous's best friend delivering a toast at the reception that made the entire room laugh and then quietly tear up. The officiant, an older man who introduced himself to our gathered families as a retired judge named Harlan Ridley, performed a ceremony that felt, in every visible, emotional way, exactly like what a legal marriage should feel like. I signed a marriage certificate at the small table set up near the chapel's entrance, Aldous signed beside me, and we filed that document away. Once we received our official copy several weeks later, in a fireproof box we kept in our bedroom closet, alongside our passports and other important papers, never once thinking to question it again for the following 11 years. I need to explain how I ended up standing at that clerk's counter over a decade later, because the specific circumstances leading to that moment matter enormously to understanding exactly how thoroughly Aldous had constructed this entire deception. We'd filed for divorce roughly 4 months before that visit to the courthouse, an amicable enough decision on paper, both of us agreeing, or so I genuinely believed at the time, that the marriage had simply run its course after 11 years, no infidelity that I was aware of, no dramatic betrayal, just a slow, gradual drift into two increasingly separate lives sharing one increasingly quiet house. The kind of ending that felt, at the time, sad but understandable, even mutual in its own way. My attorney, a careful, thorough woman named Priscilla Hartwell, had requested our original marriage certificate as part of the standard documentation required for our asset division proceedings, a request I hadn't given much thought to at all, understanding it as simply one more piece of ordinary divorce paperwork among many others we'd already assembled. When I went to retrieve it from our fireproof box, I noticed something I'd genuinely never thought to check in 11 years of marriage. The certificate listed a county clerk's office I didn't specifically recognize as the one we'd actually visited that day years earlier, a detail so minor I nearly dismissed it entirely, except that something about it nagged at me persistently enough that I decided, mostly out of simple, ordinary thoroughness, to call ahead before actually driving there myself. I want to describe that phone call in detail, because it was the first thread that eventually, completely unraveled everything I'd believed about my own marriage. I called the county clerk's office listed on our certificate, gave them our full names and the specific date of our marriage, and was told, politely but with a certain firm clarity, that they had no record whatsoever of any marriage filed under either of our names on that date, or on any date near it that year. I assumed, immediately and without much alarm, that I'd simply misdialed a digit somewhere, or that their record system had some kind of ordinary clerical error, the sort of thing that happens occasionally with government paperwork. I drove to the actual courthouse in person the following morning, certificate in hand, prepared to sort out what I still, at that point, genuinely believed was a simple administrative mistake rather than anything more significant. That's when the clerk, a patient woman named Denise who spent nearly 20 minutes searching through both digital and physical archives before finally looking up at me with that specific, careful expression I described earlier, told me something that reorganized, in the space of about 90 seconds, everything I understood about the preceding 11 years of my own life. I'm not finding any marriage license on file under either of these names for that date, she repeated, more slowly this time, or for any date within that entire year, actually. Would you like me to check whether it might have been filed in a different county instead? I want to describe the specific, physical sensation of standing at that counter, holding a document I had genuinely believed, without a single moment of doubt across 11 years, represented an established legal fact about my own life, and understanding, for the first time, that it might not be true at all. I asked Denise to check surrounding counties, understanding, even as I asked, that some rational, self-protective part of my mind was still busy constructing innocent explanations, a filing error, a records transfer that had somehow gone wrong along the way, anything at all that didn't require me to consider the considerably more disturbing possibility already forming, quietly and insistently, at the edges of my own thinking. She checked 3 additional neighboring counties over the following 20 minutes, patiently and thoroughly. Nothing turned up anywhere. I called Priscilla directly from the courthouse parking lot, my hands shaking in a way that genuinely surprised me given how entirely calm I'd felt walking into that building only an hour earlier, and explained, as clearly as I could manage, exactly what Denise had told me. Priscilla was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line before she finally said something that shaped everything I did over the following several weeks. I need you to bring me that physical certificate immediately, she said, her voice considerably more serious than I'd heard it during any of our previous, fairly routine conversations about our divorce paperwork. And I need you to not say anything to Aldous about any of this until I've had a forensic document examiner or look at it properly. If what you're describing is accurate, Renata, this isn't simply a filing error. This is potentially a fabricated legal document, and we need to understand exactly what we're actually dealing with before he has any opportunity to prepare an explanation for you. I want to explain what happened over the following week, because the process of actually confirming what I already, on some quiet level, already suspected required considerably more patience than I genuinely felt capable of maintaining in that specific, disorienting period. Priscilla retained a forensic document examiner, a meticulous, soft-spoken man named Gerald Voss who specialized in exactly this kind of authentication work, and I sat across from him in his small, cluttered downtown office while he examined our marriage certificate under a specialized ultraviolet light, comparing the paper stock, the ink composition, and the specific font used against verified, authenticated samples from that same county clerk's office during that same general period. This paper stock wasn't used by Fulton County during this specific period, he told us, after nearly an hour of careful, methodical examination, adjusting his glasses as he spoke. The seal itself is a reasonably good reproduction, genuinely well done in some respects, but under this level of magnification, you can see clearly that it's been reproduced from a photograph of an authentic seal rather than actually stamped with a real, physical seal at the time of filing. And this signature, he said, pointing carefully to the officiant's name at the bottom of the document, belongs to a real, identifiable person, a retired judge who genuinely did perform civil ceremonies during roughly this period, but I'd want to verify directly with him whether this signature is actually his or a forgery, because the specific pressure pattern looks somewhat inconsistent with genuine, spontaneous handwriting under this kind of analysis. I sat in that cluttered office feeling something considerably more complicated than simple shock, a kind of retroactive vertigo I struggled to fully articulate even to myself in that moment, understanding that an entire decade of my own lived life was suddenly, rapidly being reorganized around information I hadn't had any access to while actually, genuinely living through it. Gerald contacted the retired judge directly the following day, a man named Judge Harlan Ridley, the same name listed as our officiant, who confirmed, once shown a copy of our specific certificate, that while the general format resembled documents he had genuinely, legitimately signed during that period of his career, he had absolutely no memory whatsoever of a ceremony matching our specific names or that particular date, and that the signature itself, upon his own careful, personal examination, appeared to be traced from an actual document he had previously signed rather than representing an original, spontaneous signature of his own hand. I want to describe the specific decision I made at that exact point, because it required a considerable discipline I genuinely wasn't certain, in that moment, I actually possessed. I did not confront Aldous immediately, despite every instinct in my body wanting to demand answers the very same evening. Priscilla advised, and I agreed completely after considerable thought, that I needed to understand the full, complete scope of what he'd actually done before I said a single word to him directly, because whatever explanation he eventually offered once confronted would very likely be shaped, at least initially, by panic and self-preservation rather than complete, unguarded honesty, and I needed considerably more information than a single fabricated certificate before I could fully understand exactly what I was actually dealing with in this entire situation. Priscilla hired a private investigator, a methodical, unhurried woman named Corinne Delacroix, to trace Aldous's financial and legal history over the preceding 12 years, understanding that if our marriage had genuinely never been legally filed at all, there had to be some specific, deliberate underlying reason he'd gone to the considerable trouble of fabricating an entire government certificate rather than simply never marrying me at all, or marrying me legitimately and dealing honestly with whatever consequences that might have entailed for him personally. What Corinne discovered, over the following 3 careful weeks of investigation, revealed a pattern considerably more calculated and deliberate than a single moment of cold feet experienced on our actual wedding day. Aldous, it turned out, had inherited a considerable stake in a family manufacturing business roughly 18 months before we'd gotten married, an inheritance he'd always described to me, throughout our entire relationship, as modest, repeatedly insisting the business itself was struggling financially and worth relatively little in any meaningful sense. Corinne's careful financial tracing revealed instead that the business had actually been valued, at the specific time of his inheritance, at just over $4 million, and had grown considerably in the years since that inheritance, a fact he had never once, in 11 full years of marriage, disclosed to me in any form. Corinne also found, buried in old court and business filing records, that Aldous had consulted with an estate planning attorney roughly 2 months before our actual wedding date, specifically regarding what she described, quoting directly from the attorney's own retained notes, as asset protection strategies in the specific context of an upcoming marriage. I want to describe the specific document Corinne eventually managed to locate, because it confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt whatsoever, exactly what Aldous had actually, deliberately done from the very beginning. Buried in that estate attorney's old case files, obtained through a subpoena Priscilla filed once we finally had sufficient legal grounds to formally request it, was a detailed memo written by that specific attorney roughly 6 weeks before our wedding date, summarizing an initial consultation held with Aldous. The memo described, in careful, clinical legal language, an entire strategy the attorney had apparently outlined for him during that meeting, one involving staging what the memo itself called the appearance of a legal marriage, through a ceremony that was never actually intended to be filed with any county clerk's office whatsoever, allowing Aldous to maintain, for however long the relationship ultimately lasted, every meaningful social and practical benefit of appearing legally married, while simultaneously ensuring, through careful legal maneuvering, that no marital property claims could ever legally attach to his considerable, steadily growing family business interests. That I sat with that specific memo for a long time after first reading it, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost clinical in its cold precision, exactly what our entire marriage had actually represented from Aldous' own perspective, from the very beginning of our relationship. Not a marriage that had gradually, sadly drifted apart over 11 ordinary years, the way I'd been quietly, privately grieving it for the preceding several months of our separation. A carefully engineered legal fiction instead, constructed deliberately before we'd even exchanged a single vow, specifically designed to give him every practical, tangible benefit of a genuine marriage, a devoted partner, a well-managed household, an entire shared life, while ensuring, through calculated, premeditated fraud, that I would have no legal claim whatsoever to anything he built or acquired during the entire span of our relationship together, regardless of whatever I personally contributed to our shared life over those 11 years. I want to explain what I eventually discovered about the actual wedding day itself, because Curran's ongoing investigation eventually traced the specific, deliberate arrangements Aldous had personally made to construct that ceremony's entirely convincing appearance for everyone present, including me. The officiant who'd performed our actual ceremony, the man Aldous had found through what turned out to be a small, obscure classified listing rather than any legitimate, reputable referral from friends or family, had, according to records Curran eventually located through considerable persistence, no actual legal credentials whatsoever to perform legally binding marriages, despite presenting himself to me, and to our entire assembled family, at the time, as a retired judge, a specific claim. That turned out to be entirely, completely fabricated from beginning to end. The man's actual name, once Curran traced him through several subsequent years of address changes across multiple states, was a retired paralegal named Wendell Ashcroft, who had apparently performed several similar, deliberately informal ceremonies over the preceding years for reasons Curran's investigation didn't fully manage to clarify with certainty, though her detailed notes strongly suggested he'd been paid a modest, specific fee for his particular participation in ours. I want to describe the specific, complicated emotions I experienced learning about Wendell Ashcroft's actual identity, because it added an entirely separate layer of violation to everything else I was already struggling to process during that period. I thought about my own father, standing beside me during the ceremony, visibly emotional as he walked me down that short aisle, believing, completely and without any reservation, that he was witnessing his daughter's legal, legitimate marriage. I thought about my mother, crying quietly during our vows, entirely unaware that the man performing them held no legal authority to do so whatsoever. The specific betrayal of watching my own family experience genuine, unguarded joy over something that had been, from its very inception, an elaborate performance rather than an actual legal event, added a weight to this entire discovery that I hadn't initially anticipated when I first stood at that clerk's counter weeks earlier. I confronted Aldous roughly 5 weeks after that initial discovery at the county clerk's counter, having spent that entire intervening period carefully assembling documentation with Priscilla's continued guidance, understanding clearly that I needed the complete, undeniable picture before I gave him any opportunity whatsoever to construct an explanation specifically designed to minimize whatever this actually was. We met at Priscilla's office rather than at our own shared home, a decision I made deliberately and with considerable forethought, understanding the specific strategic value of removing any home field advantage from a man who had, apparently, been managing this elaborate legal fiction for our entire 11-year marriage without a single moment of hesitation or apparent guilt visible to me. I watched Aldous' face carefully when Priscilla laid the forensic examiner's detailed report on the conference table between us, followed immediately by the estate attorney's incriminating memo, followed finally by Curran's thorough documentation regarding Wendell Ashcroft's actual identity and complete lack of any legal credentials whatsoever. I watched something in his entire posture collapse completely in that moment, watched him understand, in real time, exactly how thoroughly this had been documented against him, exactly how little room remained anywhere for any kind of careful, managed explanation of the sort he'd clearly hoped to offer walking into that room. "I can explain the context behind all of this," he said finally, his voice considerably smaller and less certain than the confident one I'd known intimately for over 11 years. "This isn't nearly as calculated as it might look on paper, laid out like this. You consulted an estate attorney 6 full weeks before our wedding," I told him, keeping my own voice as level and controlled as I possibly could manage given the sheer magnitude of what we were actually discussing in that room, specifically to discuss protecting your considerable assets from a marriage you hadn't even officially entered into yet. You hired a fake officiant who lied to our entire family about his own credentials. You fabricated an entire government document from scratch. I need you to explain to me, honestly, exactly what context could possibly make any of that appear less calculated than it obviously, undeniably appears. He didn't have a genuine, satisfying answer for that specific challenge. Over the following hour, sitting across that conference table, he admitted, in halting, uneven pieces that came out considerably less polished than anything he'd ever presented to me during our entire relationship, that he had genuinely, sincerely loved me at the time we married, a specific claim I've had considerable time since to sit with and, ultimately, come to believe was probably true in its own limited, deeply compromised way. But his own father, he explained, decades earlier, had lost nearly half of an entirely different family business during his own contentious divorce, an outcome Aldous had apparently, privately decided, well before he ever even proposed to me, that he would absolutely never allow to happen to himself under any circumstances whatsoever, regardless of whatever that specific protection ultimately required him to do to the actual person he claimed, throughout our marriage, to genuinely love. I want to explain what this particular discovery actually meant for our ongoing divorce proceedings, because the resulting legal implications turned out to be considerably more complex than either Priscilla or I had initially anticipated when we first began this entire process months earlier. If our marriage had never been legally valid from the very beginning, the entire existing framework of our divorce proceedings essentially collapsed overnight, because you cannot legally divorce from a marriage that never actually existed in the eyes of the law in the first place. Priscilla explained, during our very first strategy session held immediately after that difficult confrontation, that this specific, unexpected development actually opened up a different, and in several important ways considerably more powerful, legal avenue than a standard, conventional divorce proceeding would have ever provided me. What you're actually looking at here, Renata, she told me during that session, speaking with a specific gravity I hadn't heard from her before, is fundamentally a fraud case, not a standard divorce case at all. Aldous knowingly, deliberately misrepresented the actual legal status of your entire relationship for 11 consecutive years, inducing you, through calculated deception, to remain in what you reasonably, understandably believed throughout that time was a fully legal marriage, causing you to forego other significant financial and legal protections you might have otherwise actively pursued, all based entirely on a fabricated document he personally created specifically to deceive you from the very outset. That's clear, substantial grounds for a civil fraud claim, and depending on how the district attorney's office ultimately decides to handle the document forgery itself as a separate matter, potentially grounds for serious criminal charges against him as well. I want to describe the specific, complicated grief of finally understanding exactly what those 11 years had actually, genuinely cost me, well beyond the obvious, immediate emotional devastation of the deception itself. I had, at Aldous's repeated and persistent urging throughout our marriage, stepped back entirely from a genuinely promising career in commercial real estate roughly 6 years into our relationship together, specifically in order to manage what he'd consistently described as our shared household responsibilities and to actively support his own business's continued expansion during that period, understanding, at the time, that this considerable personal sacrifice was simply the kind of thing devoted spouses reasonably do for each other, protected, I sincerely believed throughout, by the legal and financial partnership that marriage itself was supposed to fundamentally represent and guarantee. I had contributed, over those entire 11 years, considerable unpaid domestic labor, meaningful financial support during 2 specifically difficult periods in his business's early growth and expansion, and the kind of sustained, largely invisible domestic infrastructure that any genuinely long-term partnership inevitably requires to function smoothly, all of it built, I now understood with painful clarity, on a foundation that had never actually, legally existed at all throughout that entire period. I thought, sitting with Priscilla working through the practical implications of all this, about specific evenings I'd spent managing his business's bookkeeping when he was overwhelmed, about vacations we'd never taken because I'd insisted we reinvest that money into his growing company instead, about my own retirement savings that had grown considerably more slowly than they otherwise might have, precisely because I'd redirected so much of my own earning potential towards supporting what I genuinely believed, throughout all those years, was our shared future together. Priscilla filed formal civil fraud claims on my behalf roughly 6 weeks after that difficult initial confrontation, seeking damages that accounted not simply for what I reasonably might have received in a standard, equitable divorce settlement under ordinary circumstances, but for the additional, specific harm of having been deliberately, knowingly deceived about the fundamental legal nature of our entire relationship for well over a decade of my own adult life. The case, once formally filed with the court, drew considerable additional attention from the local district attorney's office as well, given the clear, well-documented evidence of deliberate document forgery and the sustained impersonation of a legitimate legal officiant over the entire course of that original ceremony, separate criminal charges that Aldous ultimately faced entirely apart from my own ongoing civil claims against him. I want to describe, in some detail, the specific texture of the following several months, because I think it's important to give an honest, complete account of exactly how difficult that entire period genuinely was, rather than presenting some falsely tidy, simplified version of events. I struggled considerably, during that stretch, with recurring, intrusive thoughts about every single decision I'd made over the preceding 11 years, wondering which specific choices I might have made differently had I understood, at any point, the actual legal reality underlying our entire relationship. I found myself, more than once during those particularly difficult weeks, unable to sleep properly, running through entire years of memories, searching for some earlier sign I might have somehow missed, some earlier indication that would have allowed me to discover this considerably sooner than I actually did. I began seeing a therapist during this period, a careful, patient woman named Dr. Miriam Solano, who specialized specifically in helping people process exactly this particular kind of prolonged, foundational betrayal. She helped me understand, during our earliest sessions together, that the specific grief I was experiencing wasn't simply about losing a marriage, the way conventional divorce grief typically functions. It was about something considerably more disorienting, the retroactive reorganization of an entire decade of memories I had genuinely, sincerely lived through and trusted completely, now understood through an entirely different, considerably darker lens than the one I'd actually experienced those years within at the time. You're not just grieving the end of a marriage, she told me during one particularly difficult session. You're grieving the fact that the marriage you believed you were living inside of, for 11 entire years, simply never existed in the form you understood it. That's a fundamentally different kind of loss, and it requires its own specific kind of processing, one that most people never have to navigate at all. The forensic evidence Gerald had carefully assembled, combined with the estate attorney's own incriminating memo and Wendell Ashcroft's eventual, fully cooperative testimony regarding his complete lack of any legal credentials whatsoever, proved considerably more than sufficient for both the civil and criminal proceedings that followed. Aldous ultimately reached a comprehensive settlement in my civil case rather than proceeding to a full trial, one that Priscilla negotiated carefully to reflect a genuinely fair accounting of 11 full years of contributions I had personally made to a partnership I had sincerely believed, throughout its entire duration, was legally protected under the law, along with additional, specific damages tied directly to the fraud itself and its considerable, lasting emotional and financial impact on my life. Separately, working through an entirely different legal process, Aldous ultimately pled guilty to reduced criminal charges specifically related to the document forgery itself, receiving a period of formal probation and a considerable financial fine, along with a permanent criminal record that, I later learned through several mutual business acquaintances, considerably complicated his ongoing standing within the very same business community he'd spent so many careful years protecting his family assets, specifically in order to remain a respected part of. I want to be honest that I felt, learning about that specific professional fallout, a complicated mixture of emotions rather than any simple, uncomplicated satisfaction, understanding that whatever reputation he'd lost within that community was, in some sense, an entirely predictable and appropriate consequence of choices he alone had made, deliberately and repeatedly, over more than a decade. I want to describe, briefly, what happened during the actual civil settlement negotiations, because one specific detail from that process has stayed with me considerably since. During a mediation session roughly 8 months after my initial discovery, Aldous, through his own attorney, attempted to argue that because our marriage had never been legally valid, I had no legitimate claim to any portion of assets he'd acquired during what he now characterized, for legal purposes, as simply a long-term cohabiting relationship, rather than an actual marriage. Priscilla, upon hearing this specific argument raised, simply smiled and reminded the room that Aldous himself had spent 11 consecutive years deliberately representing that relationship to me, to our families, to government agencies, and to numerous financial institutions as a legally valid marriage, and that he could not now, conveniently, disavow that same legal status specifically to avoid the consequences of his own fraud, a legal principle she referred to as estoppel, which she explained, patiently, meant he was legally prevented from taking a contradictory position now that directly benefited him, having spent over a decade actively benefiting from the opposite representation. I found a specific, quiet satisfaction in watching that particular argument collapse in real time, watching Aldous's own attorney visibly recalculate his strategy once Priscilla laid out exactly why that specific legal maneuver wouldn't actually work in his favor. It was, in its own way, one of the first moments during that entire lengthy process where I felt something closer to genuine vindication than simple, exhausted relief. I think often, still, about that specific afternoon at Denise's counter, about the particular, careful confusion visible on her face before she told me something that would eventually reorganize an entire decade of my own previously understood personal history. I think about how close I came to never fully discovering any of this at all, if Priscilla hadn't happened to request that specific certificate as part of otherwise entirely standard, routine divorce documentation, if I hadn't personally noticed one small, seemingly minor inconsistency in the county listed on that document. I understand, with real clarity now, having gained considerable distance from that initial, disorienting discovery, that whatever measure of justice I eventually managed to secure existed specifically because I trusted a small, persistent unease rather than simply, comfortably accepting the reasonable assumption that a document I'd personally looked at dozens of times over 11 full years must, obviously and without question, be exactly what it had always appeared to be. I want to describe, briefly, where things actually stand now, roughly 2 years after that initial, devastating discovery, because I think it matters to provide an honest, complete account of how my own life has genuinely developed since, rather than simply ending this entire account on the specific note of legal vindication alone. I used a portion of my eventual settlement to finally return, after considerable time away, to commercial real estate, the career I had genuinely loved before setting it aside entirely for a marriage that, I now understand clearly, had never actually legally existed at all. I've rebuilt, over these past 2 years, a professional life that belongs entirely, completely to me, with no complicated entanglement whatsoever tied to a man who spent over a decade deliberately, calculatedly ensuring I would never have any legitimate legal claim to anything he built during that same extended period. I've also, over this same stretch of time, worked considerably, with Dr. Solano's continued guidance, on rebuilding a fundamental sense of trust in my own judgment, understanding that the specific, persistent difficulty of trusting myself again after discovering a betrayal this foundational and sustained is its own separate, ongoing process, one that doesn't simply resolve itself the moment legal proceedings conclude. I've reconnected considerably with several close friends I'd unknowingly, gradually drifted from during those 11 years, friendships that had quietly atrophied as my entire life had, without my full awareness at the time, increasingly organized itself around supporting Aldous's business and maintaining our shared household above nearly everything else. If you've made it this far with me tonight, I want to ask you something honestly, something I've turned over often in the many months since this entire situation finally, fully resolved. If you discovered that the legal foundation of your own marriage, the very government document proving it had ever legally existed at all, had been deliberately, calculatedly fabricated from the very beginning of your relationship, would you have wanted to understand every single detail of exactly how and why this had happened, the way I ultimately chose to pursue, or would some part of you have genuinely preferred simply walking away entirely, without ever fully learning the complete, uncomfortable truth behind it? I read every single comment on these stories, and I genuinely want to hear your honest answer tonight, while this particular story is still sitting fresh with you. Tell me exactly where you're watching from, and tell me honestly whether you think I made the right decision pursuing this all the way through civil and criminal proceedings, rather than simply quietly walking away once I understood the basic outline of what had happened. And if this particular story reached something real in you tonight, don't just close this video and move on to whatever comes next in your feed, subscribe right now, because the stories waiting for you here are exactly the kind that people consistently tell me, again and again, that they find themselves thinking about for days afterward. I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.